This video is brought to you by the new Corsair K100 RGB keyboard. With Corsair Axon hyperprocessing technology, this keyboard is 4 times faster than any other gaming keyboard. And everyone knows that the faster you can spam those buttons, the higher your DPS. Get yours today at Corsair.com and press the advantage. Hi everyone, welcome to the visual guide for Castrum Marinum Extreme. This is the newest Extreme trial made available by patch 5.4 in Final Fantasy XIV Futures Rewritten. Trying to pug this may divide some groups or give you a splitting headache, but with this guide you'll get that weapon that leaves your friends green with envy. My name is Magitek and I'll be your trial guide. Emerald Shot will deal moderate to high damage on the primary target. Tanks be sure to use appropriate cooldowns. Optimized Ultima will deal high raid-wide damage. Shield, heal, and mitigate as necessary. Next up, Aetheroplasm production will spawn 4 blue orbs and 4 yellow orbs around the outer edge of the platform. These orbs will slowly move in towards the boss and will explode for lethal damage if left up too long. Furthermore, each orb does massive damage when popped, and players will need to pair up to share the damage of each orb. The tricky part is that the blue orbs apply a magic vulnerability up debuff, while the yellow orbs apply a physical vulnerability up debuff, meaning players cannot pop 2 of the same colored orbs. To handle this, we split the raid into groups of 2 and assign each pair to a cardinal orb to pop first. The orientation of the colors of orbs can change each time, but a good rule of thumb is if the northwest orb is yellow, everyone rotates counterclockwise to pop their second orb. If the northwest orb is blue, everyone rotates clockwise to pop their second orb. After the first orb pop, players have time to move back into the center for heals and melee uptime, before rotating appropriately to pop their second orbs. Next up, Emerald Beam will shoot out lasers from the back and the front of the boss that rotates in the direction of the arrow indicators. The boss will also be casting point blank and ring AoE attacks that players will need to dodge as they rotate around the room. At the end of the cast, the outer edge of the platform will be destroyed, limiting the available area to players. Magitek magnetism will spawn 1 stationary mine and 2 mines linked with a similar magnet tether that will soon explode in wide AoE circles. After a short countdown, the linked mines will be pushed away from each other, revealing a safe spot for the group to stand in. Both tanks will also be targeted for high damage flare markers that deal proximity-based damage. To handle this, each tank will run to one side of the stationary mine and stand at the edge of the platform in the available safe spots. The rest of the group will need to identify the eventual safe zone that forms directly in the middle of the 2 linked mines. Standing in this area will have them in the safe spot once the mines get pushed away from each other. The mines will explode and the tank flares go off, so be ready for some heavy raid-wide healing. The next Magitek magnetism will now spawn 4 mines, 2 linked with similar magnet tethers and 2 linked with opposite magnet tethers. To handle this, all players will need to quickly identify the 2 mines with similar magnets and stand in between them to be in the safe area once they all get pushed around before exploding. Another emerald beam will rotate around the room and again destroy the outer edge of the platform. Players will need to be very careful not to accidentally fall off here. When the boss's hands pop out of it like this and stay out, he'll instantly cast a massive donut attack. Players will need to preemptively position themselves inside of the boss's hitbox to avoid this. Next up, Divide at Impera will target the primary target with this red 2-player stack-up marker. Both tanks will need to stand together to share this damage with appropriate cooldowns. At the same time, the rest of the raid will need to spread apart as they will all be targeted by smaller AoE circle attacks that cannot be overlapped. To handle this, simply assign everyone a clock position around the boss. When the boss casts Split, the top and lower half will separate. Expire is a point-blank AoE attack that all players should move away from to avoid. When this large red marker appears, all players will need to move to the other side of the platform from it. It will soon grow and then explode, so make sure you're not caught in the growth. At this point, the top half will return to the emerald weapon. When the boss's hands get sucked back into it, he will instantly cast a massive point-blank AoE attack. Players will need to immediately position themselves away from the boss to avoid this. The next Magitek magnetism will again have 4 mines, and players should identify the similar mines as quickly as possible. Since the platform size has been much reduced by this point, the safe spot will be much smaller. In this round of mines, 2 players will be marked for laser pulse column AoEs. To ensure that the only available safe spot is not covered by extra AoE attacks, each marked player should first bait away the laser attacks before moving into the safe zone. There's plenty of time to do this before the mines teleport and explode, so don't panic. From here on out, you'll have another optimized Ultima to heal through, another Divide at Impera to handle, and one more optimized Ultima Blast before the boss begins his enrage cast, full power optimized Ultima. If you do not get the boss below 1% before this cast goes off, you'll need to restart. If you do, you'll hit a checkpoint, a cutscene will occur, and you'll move on to the next phase of the encounter. In this phase, phase, all players will need to be careful to avoid the outer edge of the platform or they will die. Divide et Impera will work in the same manner as before, in that the tanks will need to soak together while the rest of the group spreads around the boss to avoid overlap. However, the group attack is a 7-point cleave instead of circle AoEs on each player. Primus Terminus S will mark up 6 players with these large blue arrow markers. The orientation of the arrows will indicate in which direction that player and anyone in line with them will be knocked back. The knockback is also extremely long, so affected players will need to move to the edge of the platform opposite their arrow indicator to avoid getting thrown into the wall. These players will also need to carefully position themselves in the corners of the room without overlapping so as to leave as much of a safe spot in the center of the room for unaffected players. As long as players don't point arrows at each other, they'll be knocked back safely to the other side without killing anyone else. Tertius Terminus Est will spawn 3 sets of swords in a random pattern. These swords will then explode in the order that they drop down in either a cross or X configuration. This is the hardest mechanic in the entire encounter to get used to, as the line indicators for the AoEs are deceivingly smaller than the actual attack, and the overlap of 3 sets of swords is also incredibly confusing when you're new. The basic principle is simple. Identify the order that each set drops down and run to the third or last set to drop down. As you're doing this, the explosion indicators from each sword set will form in either an X or cross pattern. You'll need to adjust within your safe area to avoid the first sword set explosion. Once that explosion goes off, all players can move into that area to avoid the rest of the explosions. Again, these AoE explosions are pretty thick, and it may take some time for players to get used to the safe spots. With practice, you'll be dodging like a pro in no time. Legio Phantasmatis will have the weapon disappearing and the Black Wolf's image take over. The tanks should make sure they're top 2 enmity to avoid excess damage. Mechanized Maneuver will spawn 5 airships on the western edges of the arena and 1 Magitek mount in the south. Players will need to watch these airships closely as they'll soon form numbers above their heads, indicating the order in which they will swoop across the platform and release a wave of explosion attacks in their lane. To handle this, players will need to identify which airship is first, then move to the lane next to it. Once it swoops across and the first explosion occurs, players can then move into that lane behind the incoming explosions to avoid the rest of the airship attacks. Stay in this lane until the Magitek from the south begins to target the center of the arena for a massive knockback attack. Once it's safe, all players will move into the center and position themselves with their backs towards a corner to avoid getting deleted. At this point, the Emerald weapon will return and the encounter resumes. You'll see some repeat of mechanics here until the next Tertius attack. Before the swords come down, the boss will split and one of 2 things can happen, depending on which half of the weapon remains on the platform. If the bottom half remains on the platform, the boss will cast Expire, and all players will need to move out of melee range to avoid the incoming attack. The 3 sword sets will form, and players will need to find the safe spot and dodge into the first sword set explosion as usual. A large red circle AoE will also appear somewhere on the platform during this time and grow over time. As players move to dodge the swords, they will also need to keep away from the red circle to avoid overlapping damage. If instead the top half remains after the initial split, players will first need to dodge the side scathe attack, which will target the entirety of one side of the platform. Look for the glowing side of the weapon and move to the other side to avoid. Again, the sword sets and red AoE will form in a random pattern, and players will move to their safe zones to dodge everything. The tricky part here is that instead of growing in size, the red circle will explode and knock back everyone from it. To avoid death, all players will need to use a knockback immunity as they run into their sword safe areas. This all happens very quickly, so be ready. Once all 3 sword sets explode, the boss will reform and the encounter continues. The next Legio Phantasmatis will bring back the Black Wolf, but this time he'll call down an additional 3 sets of firing squad soldiers. Similar to normal mode, each line of soldiers will have 1 gap in them, and as they reform in the north, players can determine the safe spot of each firing line. However, the airships will also be doing their dive bomb runs at the same time, so finding the exact spot can be tricky. This time, players should identify the last or 5th airship to start their run and move into that lane. Once positioned, look to the north and find the gaps in each firing line. Players will need to position themselves in the gap of the first firing squad line while also staying within the 5th airship lane. Then, as each firing line shoots across the platform, adjust to the next gap, all while standing in that same 5th lane. After the final line shoots, players can then adjust back to the center to avoid death by knockback. The Emerald weapon will return and the encounter resumes. Secundus Terminus X will mark up 6 players with either a cross or X-shaped marker. Soon after, these markers will fall off players and then explode in the orientation of the original marker shape. To drop these in a controlled manner and ensure that the center of the room remains safe, all cross-shaped players can move to the corners of the arena, while all X-shaped players can move to the edges of the arena at the cardinal points. Players can then quickly return to the middle of the arena to easily avoid each attack. This is followed by yet another Tertius attack and split. Pay attention to which split version is is occurring and be ready to adjust. At this point, the mechanics will repeat until the boss begins to cast full power optimized Ultima. You'll need to destroy the weapon before the cast goes off, or you will die. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. Up next, we'll head into the Savage version of Eden's Promise. As always, thanks for watching. Till next time.